Animations Gravity's Rainbow right there, which has this cool artwork on the front. Cover was made by Frank Miller. I think that's pretty cool. But yeah, as you can see, this book is relatively thick. Not really a picture book, it's more of a word book, and there's a ton of words in here. This book has some stuff to do with World War II and some missile stuff, so we'll get into that later. But this is the first time I'm reading this book. I plan on reading this book again when I recover from reading this book. But this is my first impression of it. So this book is long. It's like 776 pages, and it's the most complex book I have ever read. And I read through textbooks. Like, hold on. I read this book, and I thought this book was easier to follow than this book. That being said, this is not a textbook, this is a storybook. But I did enjoy it a lot. There's a lot of parts in this book that are really funny, that are really interesting, that are really kind of gross. But this is the first book I read that basically has everything. It has all the elements of every other basic story I would ever read. But again, it is really long, so it has to have something in there. But basically, as far as I can tell, because this book is rather confusing, I think the plot was about there's these missiles in World War II that are coming from the Axis, like Germany is like dropping missiles, and the Allies don't know where they're going to land, but there's a guy that is suspected of having a way to find out how these guys land the missiles, and I'm not going to tell you how, but there's all this stuff that goes around trying to figure out how he's able to like accurately depict where these missiles are going to fall, and it gets into a lot of like people being paranoid and spies following around people and conspiracy theories and that kind of stuff. But then there's a lot of little side stories in here, so I could say if you could get through it, it's rather entertaining, and it's how do I say this? It's like you're reading a lot of different books that end up being in the same universe. And it's almost like every different section, every different chapter is a different person's short story. This is like a collection of essays in my mind of different things that end up relating to each other, kind of. And at the end, I honestly can't say that I for sure knew what was going on, but I can say that I did enjoy reading parts of this book, and I did learn a lot. This was one of the first books that throughout the entire reading of the book I had to keep a dictionary next to me so I could understand whatever Pynchon was talking about. The book is talking about like missiles in World War II, and it has a fair amount to do with engineering, because it talks a lot about construction of the missile and some math around like its flight paths and stuff like that. So I guess some of that could be confusing to some people. Not really for me. I'm an engineering student, so I thought that was decently straightforward. But I can see how that could be annoying to people that have no engineering background. But I don't think that's important to understand the storyline. I think some of the deeper stuff in here, you might need to know that kind of stuff. But if you're not good at engineering, then like I was totally, I feel like, blown off by the deep vocabulary, and there's a lot of like metaphors and like themes that run out through the story that I think were like totally over my head. But then I get the engineering part, so I think there's a part in here for everybody to totally miss, and there's a part in here for everybody to totally get. So if you feel lost by certain stuff, just think to yourself, other people are lost by other stuff. I think that this book is definitely not for everybody. There's some stuff in here that's like not for children, so I don't think you should let children read this book. Like, there's some intercourse in this book, and the the scenes that involve sex are extremely diverse. Like, if you can think of it happening in your mind, it probably happened in this book, almost no matter how gross it is. And it's described in pretty good detail. So, yeah, I would say that if you don't like to be disturbed if you think you're easily disturbed, or if you don't like reading graphic, erotic passages, then maybe not. But if you're okay with being relatively confused throughout the whole book, reading relatively disturbing things, and reading a lot, I'd say that it's a good book. And I'm not trying to be sarcastic and say this is a bad book, you shouldn't read it, because I think this book was very challenging, and if you want a challenge and you can get through those things, then I think you will feel more sweet than bitter at the end. But as far as my first reading goes, I feel like I'm going to understand it more now, because since I do think it is like a collection of short stories smashed together, and you can't really understand it until you understand everything. You can't like pick out one story separate from the other ones and be like, okay, this totally makes sense. Like, everything's connected. Now that I have read the books, so I have some method of connection, which is reading the book, I think I'll be a lot better at seeing like, oh, okay, that's what that means, that what that means, as I read through the book. That being said, there are some really funny passages in here. There's a part where one of the main characters, Slothrop, has to survive this ordeal. He's an American, and he gets fed a bunch of British candy, and the way they describe that is really funny. There's another part where they're at a dinner, and Slothrop and one of his friends come in and starts making these comments that make all the dinner guests like throw up, and he ruins the dinner party. And there's some really funny stuff in here, but I would say definitely if you want a challenge and you want to expand your vocabulary by like 500 words, read this. Like I had no idea what a Clyphod was, and I didn't even know you could spell words in English that start with a Q and don't have a U later. Like, Clyphod is Qlippotth, and that's a really interesting word, and I don't think I would have learned it if it hadn't been for this book. So I'm not going to say that this is for everybody, but this is definitely a challenge, and if you like accepting challenges, then I would say you should buy this, because it's like $20 worth of challenge, and it took me 2 months to read this. I timed myself, and I felt decently challenged. So, yeah. Gravity's Rainbow. Here's the back. Back also looks kind of cool. It says, the most profound and accomplished American novel since the end of World War II by the New York Republic. That's what they said about this book. So, I heard this was a really good book, and I just think it's a really good challenge. As far as why I started reading this book in general, I didn't read it because I was challenged. There's a physics paper that, if I can find it, I'll put the link in right here. And it was referencing this idea called Gravity's Rainbow from this book. And so I was like, oh, maybe to understand this paper more, I'll read this book. This book didn't help at all understanding that paper. I think, if anything, I'm more confused with that paper. But I did spend 2 months reading this book. So there you go. Review over.